There's a family you've never heard of that made the Sacklers look like amateurs. A dynasty that didn't just profit from addiction. They industrialized it, weaponized it, and turned an entire nation into their customer base. The Sackler family, the ones behind OxyContin, destroyed hundreds of thousands of American lives and made $20 billion before anyone stopped them. But a century before that, another family did the exact same thing on a scale 10 times larger. They addicted millions. They destroyed generations. They shaped the entire economy of Asia. And when it was over, when the bodies were counted and the damage was done, they didn't go to prison. They got knighthoods. They got statues. They got their names carved into hospitals and universities because that's how drug empires work. You make your money destroying lives. You launder it through charity. And by the time anyone realizes what happened, you're too respectable to touch. This is the story of the Sassoon family, the opium cartel that built modern India, bankrupted China, and walked away as heroes. And if you think this is ancient history, if you think we learned our lesson, look at your medicine cabinet because the same playbook is running right now. The names have changed, the drug has changed, but the con is identical, and it's happening on an even larger scale. Let's start in 1832. A Jewish merchant family flees Baghdad. They're running from persecution from a governor who's squeezing them for money-threatening imprisonment, maybe worse. David Sassoon, the patriarch, takes his family first to Iran. Then, calculating his next move, he looks at the map and sees British India, specifically Bombay, a colonial port city exploding with trade. Cotton pouring out, silver pouring in, and most importantly, the British East India Company operating with zero oversight and infinite greed. But here's what you need to understand about what David Sassoon was walking into. The British East India Company wasn't a company in any modern sense. It was a corporate state. It had its own army, its own courts, its own laws. It controlled territory larger than all of Europe, and it answered to nobody except its shareholders back in London. By the 1830s, the company had colonized India, not through official government action, but through pure corporate conquest. They'd fought wars, annexed kingdoms, and turned an entire subcontinent into a profit center. And their biggest product, the thing that generated more revenue than anything else, was opium. David Sassoon arrives with almost nothing. But he has three things that matter more than money. He has connections, a network of merchants across the Middle East, built by his father who served as chief treasurer in Baghdad. These weren't casual business relationships. These were deep family and religious ties, bonds of trust that couldn't be bought. In a world where contracts were hard to enforce and trust was currency, those networks were worth more than gold. He has knowledge. He understands court politics, trade routes, and how to read power. His father's position in Baghdad taught him how governments work, how officials think, and most importantly, how to position yourself as useful to people in power. And he has timing, because he arrives just as the British are solving their biggest economic problem by turning India into a drug factory. But timing alone doesn't make you rich. You have to understand what you're seeing. And David Sassoon understood immediately. He saw that the British had created a perfect criminal enterprise with legal protection, and he saw that there was room at the table for anyone willing to do the work they needed done. Here's the context you need to understand. Britain is obsessed with Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain. The British upper classes are addicted to tea. By the early 1800s, every household in Britain drinks tea daily. It's not a luxury anymore, it's a necessity. And all of it comes from China. But China doesn't want anything Britain makes. The Chinese look at British wool, British manufactured goods, British anything, and they're not interested. They have better silk, they have better porcelain, they have everything they need. So when British merchants show up wanting to buy tea, the Chinese say, "Fine, pay us in silver." And that's what happens. Every year, millions of pounds of silver flow out of British coffers into Chinese hands. The trade deficit is staggering. By some estimates, Britain is losing $8 million sterling annually. That's hundreds of millions in today's money just vanishing into China, and it's economically unsustainable. The empire is bleeding wealth. The British try everything. They try selling manufactured goods. No interest. They try negotiating better terms. China refuses. They try opening diplomatic channels. China isn't interested in equal relationships with foreign barbarians. The Chinese emperor sees Britain as a minor tributary state, not a peer. So the British are stuck. They need Chinese goods. China doesn't need British goods, and the silver keeps flowing out. This is an existential economic crisis. If it continues, Britain's entire monetary system could collapse. So they come up with a solution. And it's one of the most evil economic strategies in history. Grow opium in India. Massive fields of poppies cultivated under British supervision. Then flood China with it. Get millions of Chinese addicted. And suddenly, instead of Chinese merchants demanding silver for tea, Chinese addicts are paying silver for opium. The trade deficit reverses. Britain profits. India becomes a narcotics plantation, and China drowns in addiction. Let's be clear about what this means. The British are deliberately creating a drug epidemic. They're doing it with full knowledge of what opium does. Opium was already known in Europe. It was understood to be addictive and destructive. British doctors used it medically in tiny controlled doses, but they knew that large-scale consumption led to dependency, physical ruin, and death. They knew this, and they did it anyway because the economics worked. By 1830, British India is producing over 1,500 tons of opium annually, almost all of it destined for China. The East India Company controls the entire operation. They license farmers to grow poppies. They buy the raw opium. They process it in factories. They package it in standardized chests, and they auction it off to merchants who ship it to China. The company makes money at every stage: licensing fees, processing fees, auction revenue, and taxes on the profits. By the 1830s, opium accounts for roughly 14% of British India's total revenue, 14%. That means 1 in every 7 rupees flowing into the colonial government comes from drugs. The entire financial structure of British India is built on narcotics roads, schools, military salaries, administrative costs, all of it funded in part by opium. This isn't a criminal enterprise operating in the shadows. This is official government policy. And this is the system David Sassoon walks into. And he sees it for exactly what it is, the opportunity of a lifetime. But here's what separates the Sassoons from everyone else trying to make money in this system. Most merchants just bought opium at auction and shipped it to China. They were middlemen. David Sassoon understood that if you want to build an empire, you don't just participate in the system, you control it. Within a few years, the Sassoons dominate the trade. Not through violence, not through intimidation, but through logistics connections and vertical integration. They don't just sell opium, they control the entire supply chain. They finance the cultivation in India, providing loans to farmers, so they grow poppies instead of food. They own the warehouses where it's stored, strategically located near ports for quick shipping. They operate the ships that carry it, building their own fleet, so they're not dependent on other shippers. They run the insurance that protects those ships, creating their own insurance company to reduce costs and keep profits internal. They have agents in every port city from Kolkata to Canton. Men who speak the languages, understand the local markets, and can navigate both British and Chinese authorities. And most importantly, they have the British government's blessing. Because the Sassoons aren't rebels. They're not fighting the system or trying to subvert it. They're collaborators, perfect partners for an empire that needs someone to do the dirty work while keeping their hands officially clean. David Sassoon positions himself as loyal, reliable, and useful. When British officials need something done, the Sassoons do it. When capital is needed for colonial projects, the Sassoons provide it. When the government needs someone to trust with sensitive trade matters, the Sassoons step forward. This relationship is symbiotic. The British get a merchant class that expands their opium trade without direct government involvement. The Sassoons get protection, legal legitimacy, and access to the most profitable market in the world. It's the perfect partnership, and it makes both sides incredibly rich. By 1836, the Sassoon Company is shipping 30,000 chests of opium to China every year. Each chest weighs over 120 pounds. Do the math. That's 3.6 million pounds of refined narcotics flooding into Chinese ports annually. And the scale keeps growing. By 1840, 40,000 chests. By 1850, 50,000 chests. By the late 1850s, 59,000 chests. That's over 7 million pounds of opium every year, all of it going to one destination, China. Entire coastal cities are collapsing into addiction. Families are destroyed. You have fathers smoking themselves into oblivion while their children starve. You have workers so addicted they can't function. Shops closing because the owners are too addicted to work. Farms failing because laborers are spending their wages on drugs instead of food. Productivity craters. The Chinese government is panicking because they're watching their population and their economy disintegrate in real time. And the silver they accumulated for centuries is now flowing back out straight into British and Sassoon hands. Every ounce of silver that left Britain for tea is coming back through opium. The trade deficit has reversed. Britain is winning, and millions of Chinese are paying the price. This is the first large-scale narco-state operation in modern history, and it's not run by criminals. It's run by businessmen with British titles operating legally under colonial law. David Sassoon isn't hiding in the shadows. He's being celebrated in Bombay. He's a pillar of the community. He's funding synagogues. He's donating to charities. He's building schools. The Indian population looks at him as a generous benefactor, and the British look at him as a success story. Proof that their system works, that anyone willing to work hard can prosper under colonial rule. But the Chinese see something different. They see their nation being destroyed. They see their people enslaved to a foreign substance. They see their silver vanishing and their economy collapsing, and they try to stop it. In 1839, a Chinese official named Lin Zexu is appointed by the emperor to end the opium trade. Lin is incorruptible. He's smart, and he's determined. He arrives in Canton, the center of the opium trade, and he moves fast. He surrounds the foreign merchant warehouses. He demands they surrender all opium in their possession. And when they resist, he doesn't back down. He confiscates over 1,400 tons of opium, 400 tons, from British merchants, American merchants, and others. Then he has it destroyed, publicly mixed with lime and salt, and dumped into the ocean. It's a symbolic act. China is saying no more. We will not allow foreign merchants to poison our people. Lin Zexu writes a letter to Queen Victoria. It's formal, it's respectful, but it's devastating. He asks how Britain can morally justify selling a substance to China that is banned and controlled in Britain itself. He points out that British law recognizes opium as dangerous, that British doctors rarely prescribe it, that British society limits its use. So why, he asks, is Britain flooding China with it? Why is it acceptable to poison Chinese people, but not British people? It's a reasonable question, a moral question. And the British response is to declare war, not because Lin Zexu broke any treaty. There was no treaty. China was fully within its rights to confiscate contraband, but because destroying that opium meant destroying British property, and more importantly, it threatened the entire economic model. If China could ban opium, if they could enforce that ban, the trade deficit would reverse again. Silver would stop flowing to Britain. The empire would go back to bleeding wealth. So Britain sends gunboats. The First Opium War. 16 British warships against a Chinese military that hasn't fought a naval war in decades. It's not a fair fight. British ships have superior firepower, better tactics, and steamship technology that lets them move regardless of wind. They destroy Chinese coastal defenses. They blockade ports. They force China to negotiate. And the treaty that ends the war, the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, is one of the most one-sided agreements in history. China has to pay Britain 21 million silver dollars for the destroyed opium and war costs. China has to open 5 ports to British trade, not just Canton. China has to cede Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. China has to give British citizens extraterritoriality, meaning they're not subject to Chinese law. And nowhere in the treaty does it say opium is legal. But it doesn't have to, because by opening ports and granting British merchants free access, the opium trade becomes impossible to stop. The floodgates are open, and the Sassoons who backed Britain throughout the war, who provided ships and supplies and financial support, they're rewarded. They get first access to the new ports. They expand their operations. And the opium trade explodes from 50,000 chests in the 1840s to over 70,000 in the 1850s, more than 8 million pounds annually. China is being systematically drugged, and the Sassoons are at the center of it. But it gets worse because China doesn't accept this. They try again. In the 1850s, Chinese officials attempt to enforce anti-opium laws in the treaty ports. They try to arrest dealers. They try to confiscate shipments. And Britain sees this as a violation of the treaty. So they do it again. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860. This time, France joins Britain. The French want their own trade concessions and see an opportunity. Together, British and French forces destroy Chinese defenses, march inland, and occupy Beijing. They burn the old Summer Palace, one of the most beautiful architectural achievements in Chinese history, looting treasures and destroying irreplaceable art. It's cultural annihilation. And when China surrenders, the Treaty of Tientsin legalizes the opium trade explicitly. For the first time, opium is officially legally allowed into China. The Sassoons don't have to hide anymore, don't have to bribe officials or smuggle shipments. It's legal, sanctioned, protected, and the family's wealth explodes. By the 1850s and 1860s, the Sassoons are operating the largest private merchant empire in Asia. They're not just shipping opium. They're moving into other commodities, cotton, tea, silk. They're opening banks. They're buying real estate. They're investing in railroads and telegraph lines. Every rupee they make from opium gets reinvested into something legitimate. And this is the key to understanding how drug money becomes respectable. You don't just hoard it. You invest it. You build infrastructure. You fund industries. You employ people. You make yourself indispensable to the economy, so that when someone questions where the money came from, you can point to the jobs you created, the buildings you funded, the services you provide. And suddenly the drugs become a footnote, an uncomfortable detail that people politely ignore. Now here's where it gets darker. Because David Sassoon and his sons aren't just selling drugs. They're building legitimacy. They're donating to charities. They're funding schools and hospitals in Bombay. They're building libraries and synagogues. David Sassoon becomes a household name not for opium, but for philanthropy. In 1847, he funds the David Sassoon Library and Reading Room in Bombay, still standing today. In 1861, he donates money for the Sassoon Dock, which becomes one of Bombay's most important commercial ports. He funds schools for Jewish children. He funds hospitals. He funds orphanages. And the Indian population looks at the Sassoon name on all these institutions and thinks, what generous people, what pillars of the community. Nobody's asking where the money came from. Or, if they are, they're not asking loudly, because the British are protecting the Sassoons, elevating them, giving them honors. In 1853, David Sassoon is appointed Sheriff of Bombay. It's a ceremonial position, but it comes with status. He's now officially part of the colonial establishment. In 1872, his son, Abdullah, who goes by the English name Albert, is made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Star of India, a British title for a Jewish merchant whose fortune came from drugging China. In 1873, Albert becomes the first Jew ever granted the freedom of the City of London. Not even the Rothschilds, the wealthiest Jewish family in Europe, had received this honor yet. The Sassoons were now more respectable than the Rothschilds. Think about that. This is how you launder a drug fortune. You don't hide it. You showcase it. You plaster your name on every building. You donate so conspicuously that questioning the source becomes socially unacceptable. And you align yourself so tightly with power that attacking you means attacking the empire itself. The Sassoons understood this instinctively. Every school, every hospital, every library, every dock. It's not just charity. It's insurance. It's buying silence. It's making sure that when the history books are written, you're remembered as a benefactor, not a drug lord. And it works. To this day in Mumbai, the Sassoon buildings are landmarks. Tourists visit them, historians study them, and almost nobody mentions the opium. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party wins the Civil War and takes control of mainland China. And one of the first things they do is nationalize all foreign assets. Every building Victor Sassoon owns, every business, every investment gone seized by the state, no compensation. He loses everything overnight. Over $1 billion in today's money, just erased. Victor flees Shanghai with whatever liquid assets he can carry and relocates to the Bahamas. The Sassoon Empire in China, built over a century, is finished, completely and totally finished. And the irony is brutal. The family that made its fortune addicting China is now being expelled by a Chinese government that rose to power partly by promising to eliminate foreign exploitation. The Communist Party used the memory of the Opium Wars and the memory of foreign merchants like the Sassoons destroying Chinese society as propaganda to justify their revolution. The Sassoons didn't just lose their assets, they became a symbol of everything China was rejecting. Meanwhile, back in England, David Sassoon and Company is also collapsing. By 1939, the family's direct involvement ends entirely. The company continues under hired management, but it's a shadow of what it was. The opium trade is over. The textile operations are declining. The investments are being liquidated. And by the 1980s, the British government declares 2 former partners of the firm totally unfit to serve as company directors. That's an official finding. The remnants of the Sassoon business are so badly managed, so dysfunctional, that the government steps in and bans the people running it. The empire that once controlled 70% of global opium trade that shaped the economy of India and China ends not with a bang, but with bureaucratic humiliation. The buildings remain the libraries, the docks, the hospitals. They're still standing in Mumbai. But the family is gone, scattered, forgotten by most. The name Sassoon means nothing to the average person today. A few historians know the story. A few finance scholars study them as a case study in merchant empires, but they're not household names like Rockefeller or Rothschild. They've been erased from popular memory. And here's the lesson. Drug empires never last forever. They rise in brilliance, corrupt everything they touch, and then vanish, leaving behind ruins disguised as monuments. The Sassoons proved that truth with precision. They built cities, funded trade routes, and carved their names into the skyline of Mumbai, yet their fortune was born from addiction. For decades, their empire stretched from India's coasts to China's harbors, feeding an endless hunger that no nation could cure. But every empire of dependence eventually collapses under the weight of its own greed. Within 3 generations, the Sassoons were gone. Their buildings stood, their libraries remained open, but the family itself dissolved into the fog of history. They became a lesson, not a legend. The modern world followed their path almost perfectly. Purdue Pharma. The company behind OxyContin collapsed into bankruptcy in 2019 after years of lawsuits and public outrage. The Sackler family, once seen as patrons of medicine and art, was stripped of its reputation. Their name disappeared from museums from the Louvre, the Tate, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Yet behind the headlines, most of their wealth remained intact. Of roughly $20 billion, they surrendered only a fraction. The rest lies hidden, protected by trusts, lawyers, and time. It's the same choreography that unfolded in the 19th century, make a fortune from human suffering, offer restitution through charity, and vanish before justice arrives. The names change. The pattern does not. Look closer at the present. The same machinery that powered the Sassoons' empire still exists, only with different products. Pharmaceutical giants today are the new merchant dynasties Johnson & Johnson, McKesson, Amerisource, Bergen, Cardinal Health. These companies shipped billions of opioid pills into small American towns, far more than any medical purpose could justify. Internal reports flagged suspicious orders. Executives saw the data. They shipped anyway. Fines were paid. Apologies were issued. Yet the companies remain profitable, protected, and indispensable to the economy. The empire adapts, but never ends. More than 500,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses. The corporations that fueled the crisis call it a tragedy. Economists call it an externality. Lawyers call it settlement. The truth is simpler. It is the same story repeated profit-first morality later. This is not conspiracy. It is history. The Sassoons built their fortune legally. So did the Sacklers. The law bends to whoever writes it. When outrage grows too large, the law adjusts not to punish, but to preserve the system. Governments do not destroy drug empires. They absorb them, regulate them, and wait for the next version to appear. The pattern is clear. First comes discovery a substance that promises relief, escape, or energy. Then comes industrialization, mass production, mass distribution, and mass dependency. Then philanthropy hospitals, universities, foundations that carry the family's name. Then collapse, outrage, lawsuits, shame. And finally rebirth, a new generation, a new product, and a new promise that this time will be different. It never is. Today, the products have changed form. The addiction is not always visible. It may come in bottles labeled therapy focus or stability. Antidepressants prescribed for decades. ADHD medications shaping entire generations. Sedatives, stimulants, and painkillers that create dependency beneath the language of care. Each one a lifeline and a leash at the same time. Modern medicine doesn't sell cure. It sells continuity. The goal is no longer to end suffering, but to manage it indefinitely. Lifelong prescriptions, recurring payments, predictable profits. The business model of empire refined. That was the Sassoon vision, even if they never used the word. A customer who needs your product forever is more valuable than one who recovers. The British understood it. The Sacklers perfected it. And today's global health industry continues it legally, proudly, efficiently. Every empire of addiction depends on respectability. That is its armor. The Sassoons built docks, libraries, and schools. The Sacklers built museum wings and research centers. The next dynasty will build hospitals. Fund climate programs, sponsor scholarships, all paid for with money that began in human weakness. And the world will applaud because time always polishes what conscience cannot cleanse. The cycle is older than capitalism itself. Empire feeds desire. Desire feeds dependency. Dependency feeds profit. And profit feeds empire again. It starts the same way. It ends the same way. But what makes the story of the Sassoons extraordinary is not their greed, it is their success. They proved that morality is negotiable when wrapped in philanthropy. They turned a vice into a virtue through architecture and generosity. Their wealth built infrastructure that still stands, yet it was financed by the collapse of another civilization. Both truths coexist uncomfortably forever. The same will be said of our age. The laboratories of today create miracles and dependencies side by side. Medicines that heal and harm in equal measure. Every innovation carries a hidden cost, and every cost is measured in silence, the silence of those too dependent to protest. The lesson is not about the Sassoons or the Sacklers alone. It is about how systems transform suffering into industry, how respectability can grow from exploitation, and how memory fades faster than guilt. Because time does not destroy these legacies, it redeems them. David Sassoon died respected in 1864, honored as a civic leader. His sons inherited titles, knighthoods, and estates. In London, the family name became a symbol of progress. The word opium disappeared from their story. In its place, philanthropy, commerce, civilization. History will do the same for ours. The families behind today's crises will one day fund tomorrow's museums. Their descendants will sponsor scholarships. Their corporations will rebrand as innovators. And a century from now, someone will tell their story, just as we tell the Sassoons, and people will shake their heads convinced it could never happen again. That is the final illusion of empire, to convince us that we are different. But history does not evolve. It echoes. The Sassoons were once called the Rothschilds of the East, a compliment meant to immortalize them. Today, it sounds like a warning. Because every empire built on dependency must fall. The only question is how much of the world it takes with it before it does. Empires collapse quietly, not in battle but in forgetting. The names fade from scandal to scholarship. The buildings become landmarks. The story becomes history. And the pattern continues. So when you see a family name etched into marble above a hospital or engraved on a university library, remember this wealth can heal, but it can also hide. Generosity can cleanse memory, but it cannot wash away the truth of how that wealth was made. Every time you open a pill bottle, every time you hear the word innovation, ask yourself who profits from my dependence, who funds the silence that follows. Because somewhere, a new dynasty is already rising, one that believes it has found a safer drug, a cleaner image, a nobler purpose. It will build monuments, foundations, and trust. It will be praised as visionary. And 100 years from now, someone else will tell their story, and it will sound exactly the same. Empires of addiction never end. They only change names. And when history turns its gaze again, it will not ask who was guilty. It will ask who remembered.